The first thing we noticed about the neighborhood was how pristine everything looked, like something out of a magazine. It had that perfect suburban charm, well-maintained lawns, freshly painted houses. Even the trees looked like they'd been perfectly placed. My wife and I were looking for something quiet, something normal. She had just come off a rough deployment, an assignment that kept her on edge for months, and all she wanted now was a little peace and quiet, a neighborhood where we could relax, let our guard down. You know, the kind of place where you could step outside for a jog without someone questioning your every move. For me, I was just looking for a solid internet connection and a quiet basement to code in. That's all. No drama, no excitement. But as soon as we pulled into the driveway and saw those 4 black golf carts lined up in front of the HOA clubhouse, I knew something wasn't right. At first I thought they were just some quirky themed vehicles for a neighborhood event or a Halloween party or whatever. But no, they weren't for fun, they were for business. I should have seen the warning signs earlier, the way they were all lined up, the glossy brochures in the HOA office, the whole air of "we run this place." It seemed like a lot for just a neighborhood association. And that's when I started feeling that nagging feeling in my gut that maybe, just maybe, we had stepped into something far stranger than we'd anticipated. These weren't just golf carts. They were the Home Safety Division, or so the big, bold letters on the side of the carts said. As if that wasn't ridiculous enough, they had a budget SWAT team look to them, matte black paint jobs, flashing blue lights on the roofs, and stickers with slogans like "Neighborhood Watch" plastered everywhere. I couldn't decide if it was a joke or if someone really thought they were about to tackle a real crime wave with golf carts and sirens. But I didn't laugh. Not then. Because what followed, what came next, was a whole lot more than just a strange little HOA with an obsession over its own image. The more we settled in, the more we realized something was off. Karen Brewster, the HOA president, wasn't like the other folks we met around here. She didn't have that neighborly vibe, the welcoming spirit. No, this woman radiated a kind of unshakable authority. The first time we met her, she handed me a laminated badge, like she was some kind of official figure. She wasn't just a homeowner, she was an enforcer. And when she started laying down the rules, things like no hanging laundry outdoors, no grass over 2.75 inches, and residents must not appear intimidating during recreational activities, that's when I really began to feel like we were in the middle of some twisted version of Stepford, only with stricter rules and more rules. I didn't know it at the time, but I just unknowingly walked into a hornet's nest. And my wife? She had just returned from the battlefield. What Karen didn't know was that my wife didn't just do peacekeeping on weekends. No, she had spent years training for much higher stakes situations. Situations where the only rules were survival. At first, my wife didn't show much interest in the HOA nonsense. She had other things on her mind, mainly organizing the garage and setting up the perimeter cameras. It wasn't paranoia, it was habit. She had spent so much of her life on high alert, keeping herself prepared for whatever might come next, that I didn't think much of it. I figured she was just settling into her new routine. Me? I was in my element, hunched over my computer, eyes glued to the screen, fingers tapping away at code. As far as I was concerned, everything was fine. But as much as we tried to keep to ourselves, it didn't take long for Karen to make her presence known. She popped in unannounced one day, all smiles, handing us the community guidelines. She made sure to mention that she was available 24/7 to answer any questions. Then, like some kind of self-proclaimed neighborhood royalty, she handed me the thick stack of rules, pages upon pages of regulations, all designed to ensure the HOA's idea of harmony. The rules weren't just impractical, they were borderline absurd. No drying laundry outdoors, a very specific limit on the height of your grass, and my personal favorite, Residents couldn't look intimidating while engaging in recreational activity. I asked her what exactly that meant, and she just smiled and said, "You'll know it when you see it." I thought she was joking, but her deadpan delivery made it clear she wasn't. As she handed me the packet, I could already tell something was off with her. Her smile was that of someone who had never been challenged, never been told no, and frankly, didn't plan on it. But my wife, she didn't flinch. She just smiled and nodded politely, thanked Karen for the welcome packet, and let her leave. To most, it probably seemed like no big deal, but I could see it in my wife's eyes. She wasn't one to show it, but I knew what she was thinking. This woman has no idea what she's messing with. What Karen didn't know was that my wife had faced situations far more dangerous than anything this HOA could throw at her. And this was just another day in the life. So, fast forward a few days. My wife, now getting into a groove with her morning jogs, heads out on her usual route around the neighborhood. Just a quick loop to clear her mind. But this time, things didn't go as smoothly. I was inside, sipping my coffee, when I got an alert from the street-facing camera, motion detected. At first, I thought it was nothing, maybe a delivery or a neighbor walking by, but then I saw it. 2 of those black golf carts, the ones from the Home Safety Division, were parked across the street, blocking the way. And my wife? She was standing still in front of them, hands slightly raised. And there, right in front of her, was a guy, about 50 years old, pot-belly barely contained in his tactical vest, and in his hand, a pistol. He was shouting at her, but the audio was too faint to make out. I could feel my pulse racing. Something was seriously wrong here. I dropped my coffee and rushed outside. By the time I made it to the front yard, things had already escalated. 2 more officers had shown up, looking just as confused as the first guy. And my wife. She was just standing there, calm as ever, watching the man with the gun. Her breathing was steady, her eyes locked on him, never wavering. I was ready to shout at the guy, but then I saw my wife's hand twitch just slightly. It was barely noticeable, but it told me everything I needed to know. She was ready. She didn't even need to move fast. She could have disarmed him with a single movement, no problem. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she calmly asked him if he was law enforcement. The guy, in all his delusional authority, said, "We're HOA police. We have higher authority than city cops here." And that was the moment I saw it, the smallest smirk at the corner of my wife's mouth. She was sizing him up, taking it all in, and she gave him a chance. She said, "I'm going to ask you to lower your weapon for your safety." And that's when everything turned into a blur. In the blink of an eye, everything changed. It happened so quickly that my brain didn't even have time to process what was going on. 1 second, the guy was standing there with his gun aimed at my wife's chest, yelling something I couldn't quite hear, and the next, her hand shot out in one swift motion. I couldn't believe it. In the space of a heartbeat, the guy's weapon was on the ground, and he was flat on his stomach with my wife's knee pinning him to the pavement. The other 2 officers just stood there, completely frozen, unsure of what had just happened. She didn't even break a sweat. It was like she'd done this 1,000 times before. She was in full control. It was almost too easy. It wasn't like a movie, where the hero throws a punch and the bad guy goes flying across the room. No, this was precision, calculated. She didn't even need to raise her voice, just a quiet command and boom. He was done. I couldn't even move, could barely even breathe. I watched as my wife leaned in close to him, whispering something I couldn't hear. Whatever it was, it made his face go pale. I don't know if it was fear, shock, or both, but the guy looked like he had just seen a ghost. I'll never forget the way his eyes widened, like he was finally realizing the magnitude of the mistake he had just made. The others, still standing there like they were stuck in concrete, finally started to move. One of them fumbled for his radio, but by the time they managed to get a grip on the situation, the real police had arrived. A cruiser rolled up, and within seconds, the wannabe cops were in full damage control mode, yelling about assault, about resisting authority. But when one of the real officers looked at my wife, she just showed her ID, and after a quick look, the officer nodded and said, "You're good to go." And just like that, it was over. No questions, no explanations, nothing. The wannabe cops, now completely humiliated, scrambled to gather themselves, but their power had already crumbled. I'll admit, part of me wanted to laugh, to bask in the sheer absurdity of it all, but I knew better than to let my guard down just yet. Karen Brewster, the HOA president, wasn't the type to take defeat lightly. Not by a long shot. She wasn't done with us. Sure enough, the very next day we received an official notice, an emergency HOA meeting. It wasn't just some casual gathering of concerned neighbors. No, this was a full-on spectacle. Karen had rallied the troops, turning this little incident into a full-blown crisis. The whole neighborhood was invited, if you could even call it that. People didn't just show up, they showed up for the drama. Lawn chairs, coolers, bags of popcorn. It was like a community theater production, except this wasn't a play. This was the real deal. Everyone wanted to see how the HOA, led by Karen, was going to handle this violent assault on one of our peacekeepers. The whole thing had become a circus, and the funny thing was, we were the stars of the show. I could almost hear the whispers of my neighbors as they tried to figure out what was going to happen next. And in the middle of it all, there was Karen, pacing around the clubhouse like a dictator preparing for her speech. I don't think she realized just how far out of her depth she was. She stood at the front, like she was about to address a nation, wearing that khaki vest covered in HOA pins. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I would have thought this was a bad joke. But no, she took it all so seriously. She went on about how my wife had assaulted one of her officers, Captain Fredrickson, as he liked to call himself. He was the one who had tried to threaten my wife with a gun, and now, according to Karen, he was a hero, an injured peacekeeper. The whole thing was laughable, and even though my wife had been a lot more than just calm during the whole incident, Karen's narrative was going to be a tough one to undo. She was trying to frame this as an act of unprovoked aggression, but as I sat there, listening to Karen spin her web of lies, I knew the truth had already come out. The whole neighborhood had seen the footage. They knew exactly what had happened. And Karen? She had no idea how to stop the damage that was already done. The meeting dragged on with Karen throwing around accusations, all while my wife sat at home, sipping tea and watching the live stream. She wasn't worried, not at all. She knew the tide had already shifted in our favor. But as much as Karen tried to play the victim, the truth couldn't be hidden. The footage was out there, and the moment it was shown, Karen's carefully constructed narrative fell apart in front of everyone. There was my wife, jogging peacefully, earbuds in, completely unaware of the chaos about to unfold. Then, out of nowhere, the HOA golf cart screeched to a halt in front of her, and a man started yelling about trespassing. She pulled out her earbud, confused, trying to understand what was happening. The shouting escalated, and then the gun came out. The room was dead silent as the footage played. The gasps, the murmurs. It was clear that everyone in that room understood exactly what had happened. It wasn't some random jogger being suspicious. It wasn't someone threatening the peace of the neighborhood. It was a man with a gun, an untrained, overzealous HOA officer who had no idea what he was doing. And in less than 3 seconds, my wife had him disarmed, on the ground, pinned. No harm, no violence, just control. And the best part, she didn't even break a sweat. Karen, of course, tried to salvage her position. She claimed the video was out of context, that the HOA officers were just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. But it was too late. The entire room had seen what had really happened, and suddenly people started asking questions they hadn't thought to ask before. Where was all this HOA money going? Why did they need a police force? And what kind of training did these officers have? The answers were vague, filled with empty bureaucratic jargon. Karen's response was more of the same: deflection, accusations, lies. But it wasn't working. The crowd was turning against her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The look on her face as the truth started to sink in was priceless. I could see the panic in her eyes. She had no control over this situation. Not anymore. And for the first time since we moved in, I realized the community wasn't just afraid of Karen anymore. They were waking up. They were starting to see the truth. Karen didn't just let this go. If anything, the moment the truth started to leak out, she doubled down. She had no idea how to back down gracefully. Instead, she went on the offensive, trying to reclaim control over what had spiraled completely out of her grasp. The following days were filled with official notices, fines, and new rules, everything meant to intimidate and silence us. One of the first things she did was announce a set of emergency measures, claiming that my wife had violated community peace and safety, and thus, we needed to be punished. It didn't stop with just a fine. She pushed forward with new bylaws designed specifically to target us, such as mandatory neighborhood identification for anyone walking in public spaces, and an expansion of the HOA's so-called policing powers. At first, it seemed like she might have a shot at regaining control. After all, who would fight these ridiculous fines and rules? Who would challenge someone like Karen, who now had the whole HOA on her side? But Karen didn't realize the one thing that had shifted the entire power dynamic: the community. People were starting to notice. At first, they were quiet, the type of neighbors who just wanted to avoid confrontation, not rocking the boat. But after seeing what happened, after realizing the truth about the HOA's overreach, they were waking up. Slowly but surely, people began questioning everything. Why were we being fined for things that didn't make sense? Why was the HOA running like a small, authoritarian government? The more Karen tightened her grip, the more the community pushed back, albeit in small ways at first. It was becoming clearer. People weren't afraid of Karen anymore. They were pissed off. And they were starting to talk about it. They came to us, one by one, asking how they could help, what they could do. It was becoming a quiet movement, a community-wide revolt against the small, petty tyrannies that Karen had imposed. My wife, seeing this, knew the only way to fight this was with something stronger than fines or rules. She needed evidence. And that's when she started digging. We knew something was off, and we weren't going to sit idly by while Karen continued to exploit her position. My wife had always been good at uncovering hidden information, whether it was intelligence in the field or unaccounted-for finances. It was a skill she had developed over years of carefully piecing together details that others might overlook, and now it was time to use it against Karen. She began sifting through public records and looking into the HOA's financials. At first, it felt like a long shot, like looking for a needle in a haystack. But then, after hours of searching, we found it: the smoking gun. The HOA had been funneling money through a landscaping company called Verdant Horizon LLC. On paper, it looked legitimate. But when my wife dug deeper, she realized the company didn't exist. It was a shell. The company had been set up under the name of one of Karen's close family members, and all the money that had supposedly been spent on neighborhood improvements had gone to this non-existent entity. The HOA had paid Verdant Horizon nearly $180,000 over the last 3 years for landscaping projects, upgrades, and beautification. The problem: there were no improvements, no landscaping had been done, no fountains installed, no roads repaved. What was promised on paper didn't exist in reality. What they had actually paid for was a series of ghost projects. The fountains, the new gardens, the upgrades, they were all a mirage. All those taxpayer dollars, all that community money had gone into the pockets of Karen's cronies. The whole thing was a scam. And the more my wife looked into it, the worse it got. She cross-referenced the payment records with footage from our security system, and what we found was even worse. The timestamps on the financial records didn't match the dates of any work being done. My wife had clear time-stamped footage showing that no work was done on the days the HOA claimed they had paid for it. It was an elaborate cover-up, poorly done, but still incredibly damaging. The HOA was basically running a fraud scheme, using the neighborhood's dues to line their pockets. My wife didn't hesitate. She took the evidence and sent it to a trusted auditor, someone with the authority to investigate this kind of thing. But she didn't just send it to any auditor. No, she sent it to a federal auditor, someone who could get results. She had contacts, connections from her past work, people who knew how to cut through the red tape. Within hours, the wheels were in motion. A formal inquiry was launched, and the HOA was about to be investigated from top to bottom. Karen tried to do damage control, of course. She locked down the clubhouse, put up signs that said, "Members only," and posted threats about how anyone who was caught talking about the audit would be violating HOA policy. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. The audit was already in motion, and the whole neighborhood was starting to wake up to what was really happening. That's when people started coming to us, asking what they could do. One by one, neighbors who had kept their heads down started demanding answers. They wanted to know why their dues were increasing, why they were being fined for the tiniest infractions, why their neighborhood was being run like some kind of private kingdom. The more Karen tried to tighten her grip, the more she alienated everyone around her. It wasn't long before word of the audit spread like wildfire. People started questioning the legitimacy of the entire HOA. If they had been lying about the landscaping, what else had they been lying about? That's when it became clear. The HOA's days were numbered. The truth had gotten out, and Karen's grip on the community was slipping. But Karen wasn't finished yet. She wasn't going to let a little thing like a federal audit stop her from trying to hold on to her power. As the investigation into the HOA's finances picked up steam, Karen went into full panic mode. She sent out more fines, more letters, threatening legal action against anyone who dared to defy her. She even escalated things, sending her so-called security officers to patrol our street more frequently, pretending they were still in charge. One officer even parked across the street, trying to make it look like he was conducting some kind of surveillance. Another one crouched behind a bush, aiming a speed gun at our mailbox. These were grown adults, people who were supposed to be protecting the neighborhood, spending their time spying on us, looking for any reason to harass us. But my wife wasn't fazed. She had seen this kind of petty nonsense before. She knew exactly how to deal with it, and soon she had a plan in place. She wasn't going to waste time arguing with Karen's goons. Instead, she was going to hit them where it hurt, with hard evidence. That's when she made a call to one of her old contacts in the government. It was a short conversation, but I knew from the look in her eyes that something big was about to happen. My wife had already started preparing for the next step in this war, and Karen had no idea what was coming. The wheels were already in motion, and once they started turning, there would be no stopping them. The feds were involved now, and that was a whole new level of trouble Karen wasn't prepared for. When it seemed like Karen might finally back down, she found a way to make things worse. Karen, despite everything falling apart around her, was determined to keep fighting, convinced that she still had control. She didn't just sit in the background and let the community take charge. No, she went on the offensive. She scheduled a special city council meeting to defend her position. She claimed that the audit was fake, that it was all part of some smear campaign against her and the HOA. But Karen didn't understand one simple thing. People were fed up. They had seen through the charade. And now, they were taking action. The meeting was set up, and people showed up in droves, demanding answers. But the best part was that the moment Karen opened her mouth, it was clear that she had no leg to stand on. She began her defense like she was running for office, projecting authority, trying to pull everyone into her web of lies. She played the victim, claiming that she was being attacked by some coordinated smear campaign. But it didn't take long for people to start questioning her. There were murmurs in the room. People began asking real questions, not the kinds of questions Karen was used to dodging with vague answers. Why had the HOA spent so much money on things that didn't exist? Why had they been charging residents for things they had no record of? And then the big moment came. One of the city council members, a quiet but observant older gentleman, turned to Karen and asked, "Do you have any legal authority to fine or detain residents in your neighborhood?" Karen stammered for a second, tried to brush it off, but the damage was already done. The room went silent. People were beginning to see Karen for who she really was, a small-time dictator, playing at being a government official. She had no legal standing, no authority to be doing the things she had been doing. It wasn't just her leadership that was under fire. It was the entire HOA, and Karen couldn't escape the truth any longer. The council didn't need to say much more. The wheels were in motion, and Karen's grip was slipping faster than she realized. By the time the meeting was over, it was clear that the council was not just sympathetic to our cause, but ready to act. As the session wrapped up, people were already talking about the next steps. How could Karen and the HOA possibly survive after this? The truth was, they couldn't. And as Karen packed up her things, clearly rattled and defeated, I knew she had just sealed her own fate. The HOA was going down, and there was no turning back now. But even then, Karen wasn't done. She was like a cornered animal, thrashing around, doing everything she could to save face. She came back with a vengeance, trying to throw one last punch, this time with a legal letter. She handed us an official notice, claiming that we owed fines for various offences, mostly ridiculous things like excessive aggression and failure to display neighbourhood ID. She had even gone so far as to invent a new violation, running with hostile energy. The total fine was $1,470. It was absurd, laughable even, but Karen was serious. She wasn't backing down. My wife, calm and collected as always, took the letter and looked it over. I saw her hand twitch, the slight movement that always meant something was about to go down. She didn't get angry. She didn't shout. Instead, she calmly set the letter down and grabbed a pen. She made a note of a few names and dates, probably a list of things that Karen had gotten wrong, or things that would come back to bite her. And under her breath she muttered, "She just escalated to the wrong level." I knew exactly what she meant. Karen had just raised the stakes, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. My wife wasn't going to play Karen's petty little game anymore. Instead, she was going to hit back with something far bigger. We weren't about to let Karen get away with this, not after everything that had happened. My wife already had a plan in motion, and we were about to take it to the next level. With Karen's attempt to extort us now firmly in place, we knew that the only way to end this was to expose the truth once and for all. My wife had her old connections, people in high places, and she wasn't afraid to use them. The very next day she picked up the phone and made a call, a short conversation, but one that set everything in motion. She spoke to the right people, people who could help us take down Karen and her corrupt HOA once and for all. We weren't dealing with an overzealous neighborhood watch anymore. This was a full-blown case of fraud, misappropriation of funds, and illegal actions. We had the evidence, and we were going to make sure that Karen couldn't walk away from this one. The following week, a letter arrived at our door, an official notice from the government. The HOA was under investigation. But the real kicker? The letter came with an order to cease all enforcement activity, effective immediately. That meant no more fines, no more fake policing, no more HOA officers pulling guns on joggers. Karen's little kingdom was crumbling, and it was happening faster than she could handle. The fallout from the investigation was swift and brutal. The HOA was forced to disband. People who had once been afraid of speaking up were now coming forward, demanding answers. They wanted their money back, they wanted their dues refunded, and they wanted Karen and her cronies held accountable. As if that wasn't enough, Karen was personally called out in the court of public opinion. Her reputation, built on fear and manipulation, fell apart. She had no choice but to retreat. But it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. As we sat on our porch that evening, enjoying the peace and quiet that had returned to our neighborhood, we knew this wasn't the last we'd seen of Karen. She was the type to always come back, like a bad penny. But for now at least, the HOA was finished. And Karen, well, she was about to find out that trying to bully us was a big mistake. Weeks passed, and life started to settle into a new rhythm. The neighborhood was beginning to feel like a community again, not a prison under constant surveillance. People smiled at each other. Neighbors actually waved. It felt good, like we'd finally taken our neighborhood back. But just when we thought we could breathe easy again, Karen made her grand return. She showed up one morning, pulling up in a borrowed minivan, dressed like she was still running the show. But this time, it wasn't the same. She had a folder in her hand, a legal defense folder, and it was obvious from the way she held it that she was trying to bait us into something. My wife didn't even look up from her tablet as Karen approached the porch. She just muttered, "Leave it. She's trying to bait a reaction." And that was all. We both knew it. This was just another attempt to pull us into her web, to get us angry, so she could play the victim again. The letter she left behind was full of self-praise, full of deflections and accusations. Karen wasn't apologizing. Far from it. She was trying to spin the narrative that the audit was fake, that she had been the victim all along, that we were all part of some military intimidation campaign. But we didn't take the bait. We didn't even respond. My wife took the letter, read it over, and then forwarded it to the right authorities. And that was it. Karen had just dug her own grave even deeper, trying to resurrect a fight she had already lost. A week later, she was back in court, representing herself. The whole thing was laughable. She showed up with a slideshow, complete with clip art, trying to present herself as the wronged party. She even included a photoshopped image of my wife standing next to a tank, claiming that we were part of some paramilitary conspiracy. The judge didn't even let her finish her argument. He simply asked her one question. Did you ever have the legal authority to fine or detain residents in your neighborhood? Karen faltered, and that was the end of it. The court ruled that not only had Karen's actions been illegal, but she was also guilty of impersonating law enforcement. She was fined, ordered to pay restitution, and banned from ever holding a leadership position in any neighborhood or community for a minimum of 10 years. It was over. Karen had lost, and the neighborhood had won. My wife didn't celebrate. There was no victory dance, no "I told you so." She just went back to her normal routine. Another jog, another cup of tea, and another day of keeping our home safe. As for the rest of the neighborhood, well, they celebrated for her. They threw a block party, one that had more than its fair share of cornhole and burgers, with music that included "Another One Bites the Dust" on repeat. And that was the end of Karen, at least for now.